appalled and riddled with such awful guilt that I'd done that to my children. I was devastated.
She once said that becoming a mother was the one role in her life she never rehearsed for. And looking back at everything she put those 4 children through, without ever meaning to, it's easy to understand why she carried so much silent guilt for so many years. One child grew up never once hearing her father's voice. One child came to her broken in body, from a country still recovering from war. One child married straight into a family fortune so enormous, and so scarred by tragedy, that people still lower their voices when they mention the name. And one child simply turned his back on Hollywood altogether and never looked over his shoulder again. Their names were Michael, Christopher, Lisa, and Maria. For children born into arguably the most photographed household of the 20th century. And what became of them afterward is far stranger, far quieter, and in some ways far more moving than anything that ever played out on their mother's movie screens. Let's begin with the daughter whose life started under the heaviest shadow of them all. The one who grew up without a single memory of her own father. It was the summer of 1957, and by most accounts, Elizabeth Taylor was living through the happiest stretch of her entire life. She was married to a Broadway producer named Mike Todd, a man that people close to her later described as the one true love of her younger years. On the 6th of August, in a New York hospital, she gave birth to a little girl. They called her Elizabeth, but inside the family, she was always simply Lisa. The birth itself was rough. Lisa came early, delivered by cesarean, small and fragile, and for a nerve-wracking stretch of days, doctors kept a close watch on both mother and newborn. They pulled through. And for a handful of months afterward, the household around them looked, for possibly the only time in Taylor's adult life, genuinely peaceful. That peace didn't survive the year. In March of 1958, Mike Todd climbed aboard a private plane he had nicknamed after his wife and set off toward New York on business. Somewhere above New Mexico, the aircraft flew straight into a violent storm. It never landed. Everyone on board died instantly, Todd included. Lisa wasn't even 8 months old. She would grow into adulthood having never once heard her father's actual voice, holding on to nothing but photographs, home movies, and second-hand stories passed down by people who had known him. Those closest to Elizabeth Taylor at the time say she never truly recovered from that loss. 26 years old, suddenly widowed, suddenly the single mother of an infant, and forced to grieve it publicly, in front of photographers who gave her almost no privacy to fall apart. What came afterward was a blur most people would find impossible to survive with any sense of self intact. A marriage to the singer Eddie Fisher that collapsed almost as quickly as it began. Then a marriage to Richard Burton, the man history tends to remember her by more than any other. And for a while, at least, Burton stepped into something close to a genuine father role for little Lisa. People who watched the two of them together describe real affection there, a bond that somehow managed to survive the very public wreckage of his marriage to her mother. While all of that noise played out in headlines around the world, Lisa herself was quietly becoming someone almost nobody expected. Where her mother seemed to come alive under a spotlight, Lisa instinctively pulled away from one. Friends from her early years describe a watchful, guarded kid, far more comfortable around horses than around adults trying to make conversation with her. She showed up in family photographs at premieres because there wasn't really a choice. But she never once tried to turn that access into a career of her own. Instead, she found something with absolutely nothing to do with cameras. She picked up a chisel. Lisa went on to train seriously as a sculptor, working almost exclusively in bronze, and she built an actual, respected name for herself in a corner of the art world that has almost nothing to do with fame, depicting horses and wild animals with the kind of anatomical precision that takes years, sometimes decades, to master. People who worked alongside her have said she never once leaned on her last name to get noticed. Plenty of collectors who bought her early work apparently had no idea whose daughter they were dealing with until somebody mentioned it in passing. Her talent eventually earned her a spot in a respected published collection on horses in fine art, alongside just one other living sculptor, a genuine honor that had absolutely nothing to do with her mother's legacy. In 1984, she married a fellow artist, and the two of them settled onto a large wooded property in the Hudson Valley, about as far removed from Beverly Hills as a life could possibly get. Together they raised 2 sons. And by most accounts, those boys grew up with a far simpler, quieter picture of their grandmother than the rest of the world carried around in their heads. To them, she wasn't a legend. She was just the woman who showed up for birthdays and asked nosy questions about their report cards. Neighbors who lived near the family for those years describe an almost invisible presence. A woman who kept to herself, whose connection to one of the most famous families on the planet only became obvious if you studied her face closely enough to notice the resemblance. She and her husband eventually separated after nearly 2 decades of marriage, though by all accounts the split was gentle, and the two are said to remain on good terms to this day, living only a short distance apart for the sake of their sons. Her sculpting only grew more personal with time. One of her most talked about pieces was a life-sized bronze of a search and rescue dog, cast using salvaged material recovered from the wreckage of the World Trade Center, a tribute to the rescue crews who worked there in the aftermath of September 11th. It wasn't commissioned. It wasn't made for a gallery sale. By most accounts, it came from something far more personal, a private need to process what she, like everyone else, had watched unfold on live television. Later in life, her focus shifted overseas, toward elephant conservation work in southern Africa, where she began collaborating directly with a wildlife orphanage and eventually built an entire exhibition around the animals she'd come to know there in person. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over someone who spent their childhood watching their mother get chased down streets by photographers. And people who've spent real time with Lisa describe exactly that kind of quiet in her. Not cold. Not hiding. Just never having developed the appetite for attention that came so effortlessly to the woman who raised her. Today, in her late 60s, she still lives quietly on that same property in upstate New York, mostly outside the public eye, still letting her work do the talking the way it always has. But painful as her beginning was, Lisa's story isn't the one involving the most physical suffering in this family. That distinction belongs to a little girl who arrived a few years later from a country still rebuilding itself after war. A girl doctors weren't sure, for a long stretch of her early childhood, would ever walk the way other kids did. In the early 1960s, while still married to Eddie Fisher, Elizabeth Taylor began the process of adopting a child from Germany. The girl's name was Maria, born in Munich in the summer of 1961. Life had already dealt her a difficult hand before Taylor ever entered the picture. She'd been placed for adoption as an infant, and she'd been born with a serious congenital hip deformity, the kind of condition that, left untreated, threatens a child with permanent pain or a severe limp for life. According to people close to Taylor at the time, none of that discouraged her. If anything, it seemed to pull her in even more. Friends recall her saying she wanted this particular child specifically because she was unwell, and because she genuinely believed she could help her. It's a small detail, but it says a great deal about how Taylor approached motherhood. Not avoiding a child who needed more, but leaning directly toward her. The adoption was still working its way through legal channels when Taylor's marriage to Fisher fell apart. When she married Richard Burton in 1964, he stepped in and finished the adoption process himself, becoming, from that point on, Maria's father in every sense that actually mattered. She took his name. She grew up as Maria Burton. What followed is one of the more physically punishing chapters in this entire family story, and it rarely gets discussed in much detail, likely because it doesn't fit the glossy version of this family most people carry around. To correct her hip, Maria underwent a long, repeated series of surgeries throughout her childhood, by some counts, close to 20 separate operations. Each one demanding recovery time. Each one carrying its own risks. Each one asking a small child to summon courage most adults never have to find. Think about what her actual day-to-day childhood looked like. While her siblings were off at school plays or out riding horses, Maria was often in recovery, relearning how to walk after another procedure, spending long stretches confined to casts or braces meant to gradually reshape her hip as she grew. And yet, according to most accounts, she was never set apart or coddled inside the household. Taylor reportedly made a deliberate effort to include her in absolutely everything the other children did, refusing to let the medical reality define how the family treated her. She traveled with them. She appeared in every family portrait. She was simply one of the four, not treated as different because her path into the family looked different from theirs. As an adult, Maria moved into the world of fashion and design, while staying closely tied to the charitable causes connected to her mother's name. Her personal life carried its own share of turbulence, though. She married a man named Steve Carson, and the couple had a daughter, Eliza, born in 1982. That marriage ended around the turn of the millennium after nearly 2 decades together. She remarried in 2002, and the couple had a son together, but that second marriage also proved difficult, and the two separated only a few years later, in 2004, amid reports of real tension between them, including pointed claims afterward about how family money factored into the split, claims Maria and her representatives disputed at the time. It's the kind of painful, complicated family history that almost never makes it into the polished retrospectives, but it was very real for the people living through it. Sit with that for a moment. Most children spend their early years learning to run, to climb, to keep pace with older siblings without a second thought. Maria spent hers relearning basic movement again and again, every time a surgeon reset something inside her hip and sent her home in a cast to start the whole process over. There were entire stretches where she simply couldn't join her brothers and sister on family outings because her body wasn't ready yet. And still, those closest to the family say she rarely complained, and rarely let it define how she saw herself. Today, Maria lives a far quieter life in Idaho, largely removed from the entertainment world that shaped so much of her early years. She remains connected to her mother's charitable legacy and, by most accounts, has finally found a version of stability that took her a long time to reach. If you think her story is the most surprising twist in this family, wait until you hear what happened to Taylor's second son, a man whose marriage would eventually pull this Hollywood family directly into the orbit of one of the most disturbing kidnapping cases of the 20th century. Christopher Edward Wilding was born on the 27th of February, 1955, sharing a birthday, oddly enough, with his own mother. He was the younger of Taylor's two sons from her marriage to the British actor Michael Wilding. Like his older brother, he spent part of his childhood on movie sets, almost by default. As a boy, he made a brief appearance as an extra in one of his mother's films alongside his stepfather Richard Burton, an experience he later remembered with amusement, an itchy costume, braces on his teeth, watching the cameras roll for what felt like hours. As an adult, Christopher built a steady, largely unglamorous career behind the camera, working in sound and assistant directing on a handful of productions through the 80s and 90s. It was the kind of work that never made headlines. Colleagues on those sets reportedly had no idea, at least at first, that the quiet crew member running the sound equipment was the son of one of the most famous women alive. By most accounts, that anonymity was exactly what he'd wanted. But his personal life would end up drawing plenty of attention, whether he wanted it or not. In 1981, Christopher married a young woman named Eileen Getty. The name should sound familiar. Eileen was the granddaughter of the oil tycoon J. Paul Getty, at the time considered one of the wealthiest private individuals who had ever lived, a man whose personal fortune was routinely compared to the entire economic output of small nations. The Getty fortune dwarfed even Hollywood royalty. But that wealth came bundled with a tragedy that had shocked the entire world less than a decade before Christopher and Eileen ever met. Eileen's brother, John Paul Getty III, had been kidnapped off a street in Rome back in 1973, when he was only 16. Before the kidnapping, he'd built a reputation in the press as something of a free spirit, known for his long hair and rebellious streak. His captors demanded an enormous ransom. His own grandfather, the family patriarch, initially refused to pay a single cent, reportedly telling reporters that if he paid for one grandchild, he'd have 14 more kidnapped by morning. It remains one of the coldest statements in the history of American wealth, and it shocked the public at the time. The standoff dragged on for months, the patriarch refusing to budge even as pressure mounted. Eventually, in a horrifying escalation meant to force the family's hand, the kidnappers inflicted serious and permanent physical harm on the teenager and made sure evidence of it reached an Italian newspaper, along with a chilling warning that worse would follow if the money didn't come. Only then did the family relent, and negotiations finally moved forward. A reduced ransom was paid, and the young man was released after roughly 5 months in captivity, found alive on a roadside in southern Italy. He survived, but the ordeal left a mark that never fully healed. Reporters who covered him afterward described someone who had lost the carefree spirit he was known for before the kidnapping. In the years that followed, he struggled badly with substance abuse, and in his mid-20s he suffered a severe medical crisis that left him with permanent, life-altering disabilities for the rest of his days. His mother later became a well-known philanthropist in her own right, in part as a way of processing everything the family had endured. But the shadow of that kidnapping never fully lifted from the Getty name. That was the family Christopher Wilding married into. He and Eileen reportedly eloped quietly at a small chapel, largely because a proper high society wedding between two families like theirs felt like more attention than either of them wanted to invite. Eileen later said the kidnapping left her with a lasting wariness, not exactly of people, but of wealth itself, and of the false sense of protection that money was supposed to buy but clearly hadn't. The couple had 2 sons together. They adopted one first, reportedly during a rough patch in the marriage, hoping it might bring them closer. Not long after, Eileen became pregnant, and they welcomed a biological son in 1985. For a while, it looked like the marriage might be settling into something stable. Then things began to unravel. Eileen went through a genuinely difficult period involving substance use and serious depression following her second son's birth, a stretch of time she has since described publicly as one of the lowest points of her life, when she felt disconnected from almost everyone around her, including her own children. Worried about her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth Taylor reportedly brought her along on a trip to Paris connected to Taylor's earliest work supporting AIDS research, a trip that would end up mattering far more than either woman could have realized at the time. And then came the discovery that ended the marriage entirely, and that would go on to shape one of the most important chapters of Elizabeth Taylor's own life. In the mid-1980s, Eileen learned she had contracted HIV. At first, she told people close to her that the likely source was a blood transfusion, a far less stigmatized explanation to give at the time. It was only years later, once she felt safe enough, that she opened up about the real circumstances, that she'd contracted it during an especially painful stretch of her marriage, when she and Christopher were both struggling and the relationship had already begun to fall apart. Remember how frightening a diagnosis like that was in that exact window of history. The mid to late 1980s marked the height of public panic and misinformation around the disease, a period when even basic facts about how it spread were poorly understood, and when a diagnosis could end friendships and careers overnight, let alone marriages. Christopher and Eileen divorced by the late 80s, with Christopher taking on primary care of their two young sons in the years that followed. And here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Eileen did not disappear from the family after the divorce. She and Elizabeth Taylor remained close for the rest of Taylor's life. Eileen continued speaking of her former mother-in-law with real warmth for decades afterward, and by every account, Taylor never treated her with anything resembling judgment. Not over the affair, not over the diagnosis, not over any of it. Many people close to the family have said that watching her former daughter-in-law go through that experience up close played a genuine role in pulling Elizabeth Taylor into AIDS activism, at a moment when the cause carried enormous stigma and almost no major public figures wanted anything to do with it. Taylor went on to become one of the earliest and most visible celebrity advocates for HIV and AIDS research in the world, eventually founding her own foundation dedicated to the cause, one several of her grandchildren remain connected to today. Eileen, for her part, became a long-term survivor and built an entire second career around advocacy, founding organizations focused on housing and support for people affected by the disease. She remains connected to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation to this day, decades after her marriage to Christopher ended. The two women stayed close right up until Taylor's death in 2011. As for Christopher, he later remarried and had another son. He has stayed almost entirely out of the public eye since, continuing to work in the film industry on projects most audiences would never connect to his family name. By his own account, he keeps one particularly meaningful piece of his mother's legacy in his own home, her very first Academy Award, not displayed for visitors, simply kept close, the way a person keeps something that matters more to them than to anyone else. Christopher's story might be the most unlikely of all four children, a Hollywood son marrying into an oil fortune, that marriage colliding with the aftershocks of one of the most disturbing kidnapping cases in modern history, and the fallout from it ultimately shaping his own mother's activism on a global scale. But his older brother's path, in its own quieter way, was just as far removed from anything you'd expect from the son of a movie icon. Michael Howard Wilding Jr. was Elizabeth Taylor's firstborn, arriving in Santa Monica in January of 1953, the son of Taylor and her second husband, British actor Michael Wilding. As the oldest of the four children, Michael occupied a strange position in the family, old enough to remember a version of his mother before superstardom fully swallowed her life, yet still young enough to grow up almost entirely inside the chaos of it. Like his younger brother, Michael made a brief childhood appearance on screen, an extra in that same film alongside his stepfather. Years later, he pursued acting far more seriously than any of his siblings ever did, landing recurring roles on a couple of well-known daytime soap operas through the mid to late 80s. He even shared a screen credit with his own mother in a television movie near the end of that decade. For a stretch of years, it genuinely looked like the eldest Wilding son might carve out his own modest corner of the family business. But it was his personal life, far more than his acting resume, that revealed just how far Michael was willing to drift from the world his mother lived in. In 1970, he married a woman named Beth Clutter, and the two had a daughter together. For a stretch of years afterward, Michael lived on a commune, a lifestyle about as far removed from Beverly Hills as it's possible to get for the son of one of the most glamorous women alive. During that same period, he welcomed a second daughter with a different partner. It was an unconventional setup by any measure of the time, and it stood in complete contrast to the image most people probably assumed a child of Elizabeth Taylor's would live. Sit with that for a second. The eldest son of one of the wealthiest, most photographed women on the planet, choosing to raise his young daughter on a commune during the 1970s, far away from housekeepers and household staff and the trappings he'd grown up around. It's about as complete a rejection of the Hollywood machine as a person could make. And yet, by every account, his mother never held it against him. She stayed present in his life and in the lives of his children throughout that unconventional stretch, visiting when she could and never once suggesting he owed her a more conventional path. Michael's life eventually settled down. In 1982, he married an actress, and the two had a son together. Taylor reportedly spent real time with all three of her eldest son's children over the years, splitting holidays between them and his siblings' families whenever her schedule allowed, and they later described their grandmother as a genuinely commanding presence, someone who filled a room without ever seeming to try. At some point, Michael stepped away from acting almost entirely and reinvented himself once again. In 1991, he moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and began working as a stone sculptor, a discipline about as far removed from a Hollywood soundstage as it gets. He's described the process as something closer to a conversation with the material itself, carving slow, flowing shapes out of marble and limestone, drawing inspiration from the desert landscape around him. He said he's drawn to the forms that occur naturally when earth, wind, and water are left alone to shape something patiently over long stretches of time. There's something almost poetic about the eldest son of the most photographed woman of the 20th century choosing a craft that offers absolutely none of the instant visibility that came so naturally to his mother. A film reaches an audience the night it's released. A soap opera appearance is seen the same evening it airs. A stone sculpture, by contrast, demands months of patient physical work, chipping away at something far larger than the finished piece, with no guarantee anyone outside a handful of gallery visitors will ever see it up close. That slowness seems to be exactly what drew him to it. That career remains active today. Michael continues to show his work through galleries in both Santa Fe and Los Angeles. Now in his early 70s, he remains one of the more publicly visible of Taylor's four children, at least within the art world, even as he's kept a low profile in the entertainment press for decades. More than a decade after Elizabeth Taylor's death in March of 2011, at the age of 79, all four of her children remain connected to one another and to the legacy she left behind, even as each of them built adult lives largely outside the spotlight that defined every single day of hers. Michael Wilding Jr. still works stone in Santa Fe. Christopher Wilding lives quietly, connected to the film industry behind the scenes, holding on to the pieces of his mother's history that matter to him personally. Lisa Todd continues sculpting on her property in upstate New York, her focus increasingly turned toward wildlife conservation overseas. And Maria Burton has settled into a private life in Idaho, staying connected to her mother's charitable causes from a comfortable distance. Between the four of them, they gave Elizabeth Taylor 10 grandchildren, several of whom now carry pieces of her legacy forward directly, running her AIDS Foundation, managing her estate, keeping her memory alive in the causes she cared about most, from HIV research to wildlife conservation to housing for people who need it. None of the four children ever chased the kind of fame their mother carried for nearly 70 years. If anything, each of them built a life around the opposite instinct entirely. Privacy, craft, real distance from the cameras that followed their mother everywhere she went. Watch old interviews of Taylor talking about her children, and a pattern shows up again and again. She rarely spoke about them in terms of achievements or careers. She spoke about them in terms of how they made her feel steady, how coming home to them after a film shoot or a hospital stay was the one part of her life that never felt like a performance. Given how chaotic the rest of her world was, that steadiness might have been the rarest thing she ever had. A daughter who lost her father before she could remember him picked up a chisel and started shaping something permanent out of raw material. A daughter who arrived from hardship overseas and endured nearly 20 surgeries built a quiet family life far from any spotlight at all. A son who once lived on a commune eventually settled into a discipline built entirely around patience and slow removal, carving stone in the middle of the desert. And a son whose marriage collided with tragedy on a scale most families never come close to experiencing chose to keep one small, meaningful object from his mother's career close to him, rather than the fame that came with it. It's tempting, looking back at old footage of Elizabeth Taylor arriving at some premiere in the 60s or 70s, jewelry catching the flashbulbs, to imagine that everything in her world moved at that same glamorous pace. But somewhere behind that image, 4 children were doing homework, arguing with each other, healing from surgeries, and quietly deciding, each in their own time, exactly how much of that world they wanted to carry forward into their own lives. Not much of it, as it turned out. And maybe, given everything they each went through to get there, that was always the plan, a slow, deliberate walk away from the noise, towards something quieter and entirely their own. Elizabeth Taylor spent her entire career in front of more cameras than almost anyone in the history of American entertainment. Her 4 children spent their adult lives, for the most part, quietly and deliberately staying out of frame. And given everything each of them lived through to get there, it's hard not to see that as a legacy all its own, maybe even the most meaningful one she ever left behind.